André Bazin was an extremely prolific film theorist active throughout the 1940s, who was most well known for his belief that realism is paramount in film. He approaches film with the framework of complete or integral realism, describing film's undeniable, unbreakable association with reality in essays such as The Myth of True Cinema. Bazin more or less argued that the main purpose of cinema is to depict and reflect reality as accurately as possible. He was a big fan of long shots and deep focus, and wasn't a fan of montage or editing, as the former serves to reflect and replicate reality as accurately as possible, whereas the latter serves to distort it. A fairly logical case can be extrapolated from this in favour of prioritising realism in film, the line of reasoning being that the more realistic a film is, then the more relatable it will be to the audience, and the more relatable it is, the more immersed and invested they will be in it, so the more engaged the audience will be, and therefore you just have a better film if you try and be realistic. And yeah, that sounds like a fairly logical, pretty solid case. But is it though? If you've ever watched any decent amount of films, especially nowadays, like so far removed from the time that Bazin was active, you'll know for a fact that it is not that simple. You'll find that for fans of the Muppets films, for instance, that their immersion is not broken at all by the fact that there's human people straight-facedly interacting with a load of felt, fabric, hand-operated puppet characters. Why is that? Why is the embrace of formalism not necessarily at the expense of sacrificing audience immersion? How do films get to pull off this balancing act between formalism and realism without it breaking the audience's immersion in the film at all? That's the interesting thing that I'm going to discuss here, because a lot of films can and do achieve this balance almost all the time. Realism and formalism have been at odds in film discourse since the very birth of film as a medium of storytelling. Someone like Bazin might argue that all that film can do is replicate and reflect reality, because that's all that the mechanical camera is capable of doing, really. Whereas someone like Rudolf Arnheim might disagree. Arnheim was another well-known film theorist who was one of the many who pioneered what we now know as formalist film theory. He might argue that the camera inherently distorts reality by the very nature of filmmaking as a medium. A film is not our reality, it is a construction of a reality, constructed from the various elements and tools at the filmmaker's disposal. Elements that can be embraced in order to create a more exaggerated and artistic reality that can be likened to traditional art, as Arnheim discusses in his book, Film as Art. Yeah, it's pretty clear what the guy thinks. It's the classic debate between the Lumière brothers and Georges Méliès, between workers leaving a factory and a trip to the moon. Marc de VALK eloquently summarises these two styles of filmmaking as realist films treat film as a window upon the world, and the formalists treat film as a canvas. And not that I want to revitalise Bazin bashing into the 21st century world of film discourse, but yeah, I have to admit, I'm with Rudolf on this one. So how do we reconcile these two seemingly opposing ideas about film? Why are films that are not realistic in the slightest still incredibly immersive and investing to watch? Oh, what am I doing? Verisimilitude and realism can sometimes get confused and conflated with one another, but they are distinctly two different things. Verisimilitude is less about reflecting our own reality accurately, and it's more about creating a consistent and believable world for the film to exist within. Simply put, verisimilitude is about creating consistency and believability within your fictional world and not breaking any of the set standards for that reality. For a great example of a film that plays around with this line between formalism and realism, let's look at La La Land. La La Land is a musical romance film released in 2015, directed by Damien Chazelle. It follows the romance between aspiring actress Mia, played by Emma Stone, and aspiring musician Sebastian, played by Ken. And like any musical, it takes the concept of realism and gleefully shatters it into a million pieces. It does what many musicals very cleverly do. It opens with a musical number. Why do musicals in general almost always do this? Well, because it simply sets up the kind of world that you're about to see. This is a world where people stuck in a traffic jam can just casually get out of their cars and perform an incredibly elaborate musical dance sequence, singing a completely made-up song, perfectly, complete with gorgeous harmonies, despite half of the instrumentation of the song being nowhere to be found within the diegesis of the film itself. I digress. This isn't very realistic, is it? We are dealing with formalism in its purest form during musical numbers like this. However, the formalist elements of this film aren't as pronounced and overt as in other films like Sweeney Todd, where the costume design and set design is constantly telling you that you are not dealing with anything that can be likened to our own reality here. Unlike Sweeney Todd, whenever La La Land isn't doing musical numbers, it suddenly becomes quite a realist film. The only formalist elements that are really present in most of the incidental scenes of this film are just the standard extra diegetic elements such as the camera and cinematography, set design, costume design, etc. So surely there's a conflict of tone here, right? Half the time this film is incredibly down-to-earth, realistic, and sticks pretty closely to the laws of our own reality, but then occasionally it completely breaks everything to have a musical number, or a dance sequence, or a dream dance sequence, or our main characters suddenly flying around the planetarium and then dancing in space. And while it is a reasonable argument to make that there is a conflict of tone here and that the verisimilitude is broken by the film trying to have its cake and eat it too, I'd argue that it sort of gets away with it. Because what's one of the main themes of this film, even once you remove the musical numbers? Music, right? Sebastian is a musician. It's his main driving force throughout the movie aside from his relationship with Mia. Music is something that the pair bond over, it's something that strengthens their relationship. Mia and Sebastian meet properly at a music gig that Sebastian's performing at. Mia initially doesn't like jazz, whereas Sebastian is incredibly enthusiastic about it as a form of pure, raw, expressive, spontaneous art, and how the musicians can effortlessly play off of one another, much like Sebastian and Mia do throughout the film. And that enthusiasm rubs off on her, and the pair bond and their relationship strengthens because of it. Music is at the core of this film, so it makes perfect sense, it's perfectly consistent for this film to be a musical. Aside from music, what's another main theme of this musical romance film? Love. That kind of early relationship, giddy, burning love, where all reality just fades away, you're not thinking straight, and all that matters is holding on to this raw feeling of being with this person that you just absolutely adore. These realism-breaking scenes are an embrace of its form, of its genre as a musical romance. It's an appeal to the sensory and to the emotional. No, what we are seeing here is not literally real, but it is emotionally real. It's not about trying to depict reality, it's about trying to depict the feeling of falling in love visually. What does it feel like to fall in love? It feels like you are the only two things in the universe, dancing in the starlight. It's a visualization of the emotional experience that these two people are feeling, as opposed to something that we are supposed to take literally and think is actually happening in real life. And thanks to these musical moments occurring right from the start, before Seb and Mia even meet, it allows the film to be able to push these boundaries of realism and formalism without breaking consistency or believability. In a film where people can just casually get out of their cars and perform an elaborate dance number, or where Mia's friends can hype her up to go out with them by also performing a dance number, it isn't much of a stretch to go from that to a perfectly in-sync tap dancing scene, or gravity-defying planetarium dancing, or a full-on interpretive dance sequence of the alternate life that they could have lived. There is no conflict of tone here. In conclusion, when it comes to realism and formalism, La La Land and films like it absolutely get to have their cake and eat it. The film opens with a musical number, immediately rejecting the desire to be a realistic film. This allows it to push these more emotional and unrealistic aspects to such an extent without breaking consistency. With its musical nature presented to us right from the start, and its visual and oral appeal to the sensory and to the emotionally real, and with love and music and emotion being the red-hot, burning core themes of this film, I think that a much stronger case can be made that the verisimilitude in this film remains very much intact, and similar such cases can be made for other unrealistic films that are still investing, compelling, consistent, and believable. Sure, these things can be incredibly subjective based on your taste in film, so maybe this one doesn't quite strike that perfect balance that you're looking for, and as a result, you might struggle to get invested in it. However, I think because of everything that I've presented here, it's very difficult to argue that the film does have a legitimate consistency problem, or that the verisimilitude is broken by this very careful balancing act between formalism and realism. But if all other arguments fail and you still think that the formalist elements of this film undercut or even ruin the otherwise realistic feeling of the film, then you're just allergic to fun.